Hi everyone. Today video is on CRUD operation demo with .NET 6 Web API as a backend server, SQL database for fetching the data, and Angular13 for front-end application. Okay, so we are going to build a single page application with the help of Angular and the .NET 6 Web API. Okay, so main objectives of this video are understanding communication between .NET API application and Angular application and installing SQL Server and SQL Management Studio, and we are going to create a small sample table. Okay, these are the initial objectives for now. So here is a small diagrammatic representation of the .NET API and Angular application communication. So user requests the domain. Then Angular application JS file will run on the user browser, and internally they are going to invoke HTTP request to the API. Once the API is triggered, it's going to query the database and fetches the data and returns the data as response like JSON. So that JSON data will be handled by the Angular application and renders as the output to the user. That is the flow of the Angular application. And one more benefit of the Angular application is everything will be Ajax and there is no page refresh. It is a single page application. Okay, using Angular itself is a single page application. And for this demo, we need SQL database, right? So such like download SQL Server, and here is the Microsoft link. Click over it, okay? For downloading the SQL Server into your local machine. And here you can see a developer instance of SQL Server. So please download it and install into our local machine. Okay, after installing SQL Server, we need to have a SQL Management Studio, which is the IDE for the SQL Server. Okay, for that you can search like download SQL Management Studio and click it the top link that from Microsoft. Okay, and here is the free version of SQL Management Studio. You can run and install into your local machine. So once you install, you can see a interface like this, and you can connect to your local server, and you can look like this. So here is the database folder. So if you want to create a new database, right click on it. Okay, click on new database, and then you can specify the name of the database. Since I have already have database, so what we need next means, so after creating database, what we want to do means we want a table. So after creating the database, let's create a sample table inside of it, something like the students that contains columns like ID, name, age, and gender. Okay. So here is a small sample script for creating the student table. So ID column, which is identity and primary key as well, and it is not nullable and it is an int type, and name and age is an integer, gender is varchar. Like that, you can specify column and its type, and you can run this script against your database so that a sample table will be created. Okay. So next objectives of our demo is creating Angular 13 application and installing and configuring Bootstrap into it and adding Bootstrap menu into the Angular application. Okay, this is a small diagrammatical representation of the Angular components. So basically, Angular is built on components. Component means nothing but separating the logic as small pieces or small units is called component. So usually component contains .ts file, which is nothing but a TypeScript file, and HTML file and CSS file. So these three files combinedly can called as a component. Okay, so here you can see styles and HTML template, and here component I have specified nothing but a TypeScript file. So these three combinedly makes a component. So here, whenever a event raised in the HTML can be read inside of our component TypeScript file, TS file. Okay, so based on that click, we can add logic inside of the click method. Similarly, data flow between the HTML and the component is two-way, means from HTML to TS file or from TS file to HTML, data can be transferred. Okay, so that is the beautiful and benefit of the Angular two-way data binding. Okay, so to run and configure Angular into Angular application, first we need to have Angular CLI into our system. Okay, so please make sure to install the Angular CLI into your local machine. So command is like npm install -z for global @Angular/CLI. Okay, please install the Angular CLI. So next command for creating the Angular project is ng space new space name of your project. Okay. So first let's create the Angular project. So here is the command which we have previously seen, right? Same command ng space new space name of your project. So I named my project as student app. Okay. So let's run it. So while installing, CLI command will expect few confirmation from us. So please provide them. So here first confirmation it needs, would you like to add the Angular routing? So basically in real-time application, it is good to have a routing. Okay. This demo is for as far as the beginners. So for this demo, we no need Angular routing. So just type N and enter. And next it will ask for which style sheet would you like. I will use default, that is CSS style sheet. Okay. So now it's going to install the npm packages. Okay. So our application is successfully created. So let's open our project in the Visual Studio Code Editor, which is a free and very good editor. Okay. So if you haven't installed Visual Studio Code Editor in your system, go to Visual Studio Code and go for downloads and select your operating system and install the Visual Studio Code Editor. Okay. Since I have already installed, I am going to open my Angular project directly into the Visual Studio Code Editor. So here is my Angular application. Okay. So first let's understand or let's get familiar with the project. Okay. Here in this, first let's understand what is package.json file. Okay. So package.json file contains commands, that commands for build the project, running the project, or test the project. Okay. So we can configure the commands here. And next it contains dependencies. So dependencies are nothing but the JS libraries that are required to start our Angular application or build our Angular application. Okay. Next, you can see one more option like dev dependencies. So dev dependencies are nothing but those are also JS files, but those are required at the time of development. So basically, package.json consists of commands and the packages that we require to build the Angular application. And the next file is Angular.json. So it will contain all the setup configuration, how to build and how to run the Angular application. Okay. So that is about Angular JSON file. And next, if you go to the SRC, and here you can see the index.html. So this is the only HTML file that going to be served by the Angular application, because in this HTML only our components are get rendered. If you observe, by default component that is rendered is app.root component. So within this area, all our Angular components which we build in future are gets rendered. So this is the entry file, and this is the only one and only file inside of the Angular application, that is why called Angular is a single page application. That single page is index.html. Okay. And next file we can check is main.ts file. So this is a TypeScript file, and this is like a entry file where it will bundle or where it will enters into the execution of the Angular app. Okay. And next thing, go inside of the app. So app is nothing but a folder that consists of default component like app component. Here you can see the app component files like app component.cs, app component.html, app component.ts. And here we have another file that is app module. So in Angular, we can group the set of components into a module. Okay. So here is app module is the default and the root module of the entire application. Okay. So all the components we can uh, group them by creating the sub modules. Okay. But the main module or the root module will be our app module. Okay. So that's about the basic knowledge on the Angular application. So command to run our Angular application is ng space serve. So let's try to run our Angular application. Okay, now in Visual Studio Code, we can open the terminal. Here you can see terminal and you can enter the command like ng serve. That's going to build and run our Angular application under a localhost server. Okay, so our application is running and here you can see the localhost that our Angular application running. So let's open it. So this is the startup HTML that we are going to get in the Angular application bundle. Okay. Now let's install or configure the Angular bootstrap into our Angular application. So command to install bootstrap is npm install bootstrap. Okay. Open terminal again. Let's stop our Angular application. Okay. npm install bootstrap. Let's install it. Okay. Package has been successfully installed. To get confirmation, go to package.json and in the dependencies, we can see our package is installed or not. Here we can observe bootstrap package is installed. Okay. Next step is we need to configure the JS and CSS files of the bootstrap into our Angular application. Okay. For that, go to Angular JSON file. Okay. Here in the styles array, let's add our bootstrap path as well. Okay. Hyphen module slash bootstrap slash dist slash css bootstrap dot min dot css. Okay, and in the scripts array, let's add our JS bootstrap JS file. Okay, bootstrap bootstrap min dot JS file. Okay, all this HTML contains default we are loading from the app component dot HTML file. Okay, app component dot HTML file. So now let's remove this uh, default HTML and here let's add the bootstrap menu. Okay. So search like bootstrap and go to getbootstrap.com and go for docs and in the content, not in the content, in the components, go for navbar. Okay, and copy this menu HTML sample HTML, paste it over our HTML component. So let's get rid of this existing unwanted HTML. Okay, I want only this header. So students app and I want blue background that is like primary. Okay. So now rerun the application. See if you reload our Angular application look like this. Okay. Next objective of our demo are What is .NET 6 Web API? Installing .NET 6 SDK, creating a .NET 6 Web API application. What is NT Framework Core? Install NT Framework Core NuGet packages, SQL connection string, set up NT Framework Core database context. So here is a small diagrammatic representation of a Web API. So in general, Web API is a framework for building HTTP services that can be accessed from any client like browser, mobile devices, or desktop apps. Okay. In simple terminology, API it means application programming interface. So it is an interface module that contains a programming function that can be requested via HTTP calls to save or fetch the data by their respective clients. Okay, so simply an API is a function that's get executed whenever the clients request for saving or fetching the data from it. Okay, so here you can see Web API will fetches the data from the database and it will can serve to any kind of client application like a desktop, mobile, or any application. Okay, so to work with .NET 6 API, best editors are Visual Studio 2022 or Visual Studio Code. Okay, so you, we must have Visual Studio 2022 in our local machine to work with the .NET 6 API. Okay, so you can search like Visual Studio 2022 download and go to the official link and here you can see the download. So community version is there, free and fully functional IDE. Okay, so you can, if you want, we can install it. So other way is we can use Visual Studio Code Editor with the CLI commands. So if you are using Visual Studio Code Editor, we need to install the .NET 6 SDK explicitly. Whereas if you are using the Visual Studio 2022, no need to download explicitly. Okay. So for this demo, I am going to use the Visual Studio Code and .NET CLI. Okay. So for this Visual Studio Code developers, follow these steps. Okay, search like .NET 6 download and click here. So here on left hand side you can see the SDKs and here you can download the appropriate uh, SDK based on your operating system. Okay, so make sure to install the .NET 6 SDK if you are not using Visual Studio 2022. Okay, since I have already downloaded and installed, I am not doing it again. Okay, next let's create a .NET 6 Web API project. For Visual Studio 2020 users, it is very simple. There are predefined templates where you can directly select with the visual interface. Okay, for CLI users, we can use the commands to generate the templates, API template project. Okay, here is my CLI command. So command is like .NET space new space web API. That is my template name. I want to create space -o that represent create a output directory or a folder and space your application name. Okay. So let's create the API project. Sorry, template name. Let me correct it. Web API. Okay, project has been successfully created. You can see here student.api folder created. So let's open our project in Visual Studio Code Editor. Okay, here is my API project and you can see the target framework is .NET 6.0. Okay, and let's go through the project briefly to understand our API project. So main thing we can focus here is the program.cs file. Okay, so here program.cs file is by default set up with few service registrations and few middlewares. Okay, so here If anything, builder.service means registering some kind of service. Okay. And app dot means we are configuring some middleware. Okay. These middlewares will be executed for every request sequentially by the order they specify. Okay. If you observe here, by default, we have registered service like controller service and endpoint API Explorer service and Swagger generation service. Okay, so these are three we can observe by default registered. And coming to the middlewares, we can see if it is a development mode based on environmental variable, we can optionally configure the middleware. See here, Swagger is showing for only development mode, and here you can see that Swagger middleware and HTTP redirection middleware, HTTP authorized middleware, and app controller middleware. So this middleware is for routing and authorization is for authorization. HTTPS redirection means if the request is HTTP, then it will be automatically redirected to the HTTPS. So like this, we can configure the middlewares in the program.cs. And next, we can see a folder like controllers. By default, you will get a weather forecast controller. We can ignore that controller. Okay, so basically, all controllers will be created in this folder. Okay, so that's all about the basic overview of the API. And one more file, that is app setting.json file. Like any configurations, we can add here. Okay, so from our API project to interact with database, we need a framework or a library. So the most recommended or default framework to communicate from a .NET 6 Web API is Entry Framework Core. Okay, so Entry Framework Core is a bridge between the API project and the database for establishing the communication or fetching the data from the database to application or saving the data from the application to the database. Okay, it is a bridge and it provides a lot of extension methods with the help of LinkU where we can query or filter the data from the database very easily. Okay, so that is the use of NT framework core. So we are going to utilize that library in our API project. Okay, so for utilizing it, we need to install few Microsoft NT framework core NuGet packages. So let's install them into our API project. First package we are going to install is Microsoft.NT Framework Core. Okay, so package manager command, Visual Studio users, 2022 users can copy from here. For CLI users, we have to copy from here. So copy the command, install the package. And the second package that we have to install, that is Microsoft.NT Framework Core.SQL Server. Okay, so let me copy the command, install the package. Okay, now we have successfully installed the packages that are related to NT Framework Core, right? Now let's understand the SQL connection string. So to establish a communication between the API project or any .NET project with the database, we have a connection string. Okay, so this connection string made up of there are a lot of configurational options for preparing the connection string. So here are the basic connection string options that are helpful for us to create a SQL connection string. So first here you can see data source. So in the data source equal to, you have to specify the name of your SQL server name. Next, semicolon initial catalog. So initial catalog is nothing but the name of your database. Okay. Next, integrated security equal to true. That means we are not going to specify the username and password explicitly. We are telling the application or database to accept the current logged in user of your local machine Windows system user. Okay, that is the integrated security equal to true. Okay, and next option, connection timeout. So connection timeout, we can specify the time period that the connection should be established between the app and the open between the app and the database. Okay, so like this, using these configuration options, you have to prepare your connections. Now, in our app settings.development.json, let's add our connection string. For that, Here there is a default property in the app setting.development.json, that is connection string. Add it, and inside of it, let's prepare our own property name. Okay, so my database will be my old DB. So I will name it like my old DB connection. Okay, and here add your connection string. And now let's establish the set up the NT framework code database context. Okay, so we know that database context is a equivalent class in the application. So it is a class that is equivalent to the database. Okay, so now what we will do, create a folder like data and create one more folder like entities. Before creating the database context class, first let's create our table class. Okay, so to communicate with the database, we should have a POCO plain class. Okay, plain C# class in our application that is exactly equivalent to the table in the database, and the property names must be matches with the column names of the table. Okay, so let me create my student table class like student.cs. So here is our student table class. Let's add properties that match with the column name. So these are the properties of my class. Now we can create our database context class. Okay. So now under data folder, let's add our database context like, and in student class, small correction here, please give full qualified namespace. Okay, with reference to the folder structure. Okay. Okay, here is our plain database context. Okay, now to make it database context class, we must inherit DB context. So that is from Microsoft.NT Framework Core library. Okay, next let's add the constructor. So into this constructor, we need to provide database context options. Okay, and here type will be our class name only. Okay, like this, we have to create our constructor. Okay, next we have to register our table classes into the DB context. If you have n number of table classes, those n number should be registered here. Okay, for register them, we have to use the DB set, and here you can specify the student. Okay, and here student, our project namespace and class namespace are matching, right? So it will throw some compilation error. So in that case, we can specify our fully qualified namespace like student API data dot entities dot student. Okay, and specify like a property. Each table must be registered as a property inside of it. Okay, that's about our DB context. And next, we have to register our database context into the program.cs file. Okay, so let's go to program.cs, builder services, and we can call a service like add DB context. Okay, so to this DB context, we have to pass our context class type name. Okay, so because if we register here, our DB context will be injected wherever we want into our application. Okay, and options, and let's import the namespace of DB context. Okay, and options dot use SQL server Okay. So here inside of it, we have to pass our connection string. For that, we configurations dot get connections. So to this method, what we have to do means our property name is there, right? Property name that should be passed here. Okay. So that's it. Those are the changes required for the enabling the DB context into our project. So now our objectives are creating student controller in API project, creating HTTP GET action method in the API project for implementing the read operation. So read operation means fetching the data from the API. Okay. Next, we are going to create student component in Angular application, and we are going to create a student model in Angular application. So this model is for capturing the response data from the API in the Angular application. Okay. And next, we are going to add student service file. In that, we are going to implement invoking the calls for the API. Okay. And we are going to bind the API response in the student component in Angular application. And finally, we are going to fix the cross origin issue. Okay. So these are the objectives for now. In our API projects, let's create the student controller. Okay. So to create the controller, here in the controllers folder, we need to add. So what is a controller? Controller is a entity or a class that contains logical methods or functions that get executed for HTTP request from the controller. Okay, it is nothing but a simply a class that contains the functions. Those functions are nothing but the action methods. So each action method get executed based on the HTTP request from the client. Okay, let's create controller student controller. So here is our student controller. So to make any class as a controller, it should inherit the controller base that inherits from Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC.controller base. And here you can see an attribute that is API attribute we have decorated that implies some special features that are related to the API controller. Okay. And you can configure routing, and here you can see the expression in the square brackets. So this is nothing but name of the controller will be the name of the route of the path. Okay. So the path will be the name of the controller by excluding the controller keyword. Okay. Means student is my path, path of this API. Okay. Now let's create a action method for HTTP GET request. So in that action method, we are going to implement logic for returning the collection of students as a response. Okay. So let's create the action method. So public, my action method is asynchronous. Okay. Task. Okay. And we want to fetch the data from the database. For that, we are going to use our database context, right? So let's inject the database context into my controller. Okay, like this, inject the context. Now from this context, we can query our database using the link extension methods. Okay, so students equal to a database context dot my student type dot to list. Okay, I think this is a link queue extension method for fetching the collection of records, but we are using asynchronous call, right? It should be async. So that async is extension that loads from NT framework core. Import that namespace. Okay, and it is async. It should be awaited. And finally, we are going to return the 200 response with the help of OK method. So this OK method will return 200 response with the object we specified as a JSON to the client. So we will pass students as the input to the OK method. Okay, and our action method should be defined its HTTP verb, that is HTTP get, and here we can create route attribute optional, because if our container contains only single HTTP get method and its name by convention contains get, we no need to specify the route explicitly. But if we have more than two get approach methods, then in that case, at least one action method should be decorated with route attribute and need to specify the route explicitly. Okay. Now let's run our API project and we can look the our API student API endpoint in a Swagger for the developers to test the API call. Okay, so let's run the API project. And here is the Swagger UI and here is the our student get endpoint. Okay, so if you click on tryout button and click on execute, it should return 200 response with the data from the database. I have already inserted some dummy data into my table, so I am expecting that output as a response for this endpoint. Getting error students. Okay, my table name is only student, but I have specified plural in the property. So this property name should match our table name. Okay, student, and let's change it in action method as well. Now rerun the application. Now again execute our student API endpoint. Okay. Now you can see the response. This is my dummy data I have stored in the database. Okay. Next, let's create a student component in the Angular application. Command for creating the student component is ng g for generate component space name of your component. Okay, since I want to create student, I have specified here student, and I have also mentioned the flag to skip the test file. For my demo, I no need to have the test files, Angular test files. By default, they are going to be created if we won't specify or won't skip them explicitly. Let's create the student component. Ngg component space name of the student, name of the component, hyphen skip tests. Okay, and you can see some files have been created. Let's go to our folder structure. Inside of the app folder, you can see now student component folder is created. Inside of it, it contains student component.ts file, component.html file, component.cs file. Okay, and here one more thing we have to observe. It is automatically imported our student component into our app module. Okay, next let's create a model, that is student model, in our API, sorry, in our Angular project. Why? Because here you can see we are getting some JSON response, right? To map this JSON response in Angular application, let's create a model. So for creating a simple model using Angular CLI commands, that is ng space g space class and space folder where we want to create the our file slash your file name. Okay, here I want to create the student model inside of the student folder. Okay, and finally I want to skip the test file. So this is how command look like. Now let's create the student model. Ng generate class, and for inside of the student folder I want write student folder and slash. Next I want to specify the name of my file. I want student as a name to my model, space hyphen skip test. And here you can see the success message like created. So if we check in folder structure, here you can see our student ts file inside of the student folder. And let me change it to an interface. Okay, and let's add the response models like number, name, age, gender. So these are my response model properties. Okay, gender will be string. Now let's create the student service file in our Angular application, where in the services files where we can uh, implement the logic for invoking the API calls. Okay, so the command for creating the service files is ng space g space service and the folder name, next the file name. Okay, so let's create the service file. So ng space g, I want to create service space, I want to create inside of the student folder and the my service file name. Okay, file has been successfully created. If we go to the file, here is the service file that is created, and service files always decorated with the injectable because the service files will be injected into the components mostly. So to make a class to be injected into the inside of the constructor of the component, it should be decorated with the injectable. So provide in root means we can inject wherever we want. Okay, and in the entire application. Okay, now here let's implement the our API call logic. First, let's inject the HTTP client instance that loads from Angular HTTP library. Okay, so private HTTP client. So HTTP client is used to call the API calls. Okay, let's import the namespace that loads from @Angular common slash HTTP. Okay, and HTTP client. Now let's write a get method to invoke our API call. Okay, in this get method, I can specify like this dot HTTP client dot get. See, these are the methods get to post. All these are methods that going to invoke the respective API. Okay, so mine is a get method, right? And it's going to return collection of student as my response. Okay, so let's import the student namespace. And here we need to specify the URL. So my API URL is just copy this line here from the Swagger and paste it over here. So now we are ready with our logic for invoking the API call. So here we are using HTTP client instance, right? So we must load the HTTP client module in the app module. So go to app module, okay, import HTTP client module. Okay, so HTTP client module also loads from Angular common slash HTTP. Okay, next we need to bind the API response into our student component HTML file. So for that, what we will do, let's open my student component TS file, student component TS file. Okay, so this is my component TS file. So to make it as a component, it should be decorated with the component. Okay, and that loads from Angular core, and this selector property inside of the component, it is to specify the HTML element tag. Okay, so this name can be used as a HTML element tag to render the component. Okay, so rendering component means PS, HTML, CSS. This entire thing bundle is called a component. Okay, and template URL. So it is referencing the HTML template for this component, and styles URL. It is representing the CSS styles URL for this component. So styles can have multiple files. Okay, and here is our component Angular component, student component, and it implements ng on init because on init is a Angular lifecycle method that executes one time when the component is rendering, okay, or initialized. Okay, so to implement the default method inside of our complement, then we must implement this on init instance. Okay, now what I will do, I will create a variable like students, and that type is student. Okay, that loads from our student model, and initially it will be empty. So this variable will be used for binding the data in our component HTML file. Okay, so once the component is loaded, we want to call the API call and we want to bind the data, right? So first let's define a method like a get. Okay, so we want to use the service, student service. For that, let's inject the student service here, the component like student service. Okay, so student service loads from the student service file. Okay, now here I can use this dot student service dot get, and here we want to subscribe this get for invoking the API call, and we want here subscribe to response. Okay, and it contains three kinds of data properties. One is next, once the subscription is successful, this next method gets executed. Okay, so here we will receive the our response. So what we want to do, we want to assign that response to our student, right? So we can this dot student equal to data. Okay, so if the API call is not successful, then this error property gets executed. Okay, for this demo, I simply log the error into the console. In real application, you can add some post notification. Okay, so this method is calling our service get method, that means API call invokes, and subscribing means waiting for the response from the API. If it is successful, it will execute this next property. If it failed, it executes this error property. And this API should be invoked when the component is rendered, right? So the ideal place to call this method is on initialize, because when the component first time rendered, only single time this method gets executed, right? So in this method, we are going to call out this dot get method. Okay, next open the component HTML file. So here, once we got the response, I want to bind the response to the table. So let's add some bootstrap table here. So go to official bootstrap website, go to docs. Okay, here in the content, select the tables. Okay, here let's copy this HTML. So let's paste this table, bootstrap table, in my student component.html file. So let's change the column headings: ID, name, age, gender. Okay, and let's remove this two tier. Let's leave one. So now we will get array of data, right? So to render that array of data, we must loop the data. For looping in Angular, we can use ng for. For means looping. For looping. Okay, star ng for. Okay, equal to let, like template constant variable. Okay, sd that represent my student of this is a keyword for looping the ng for student array. So we have defined our variable student, right? So from that student variable we are looping the data, so we have to specify that variable here, student. Okay, now on every iteration our each student will be assigned to this variable. So from this variable we can extract the each property of the student entity. Okay, now we want to bind them to our th and tds. So for binding we can use Angular interpolation. Angular interpolation nothing but open flower brackets. Two flower brackets, inside of it specify the uh, property like data we want to bind. So sd dot id, like that. If you want to bind, open flower braces. This is called interpolation binding. This is one way binding. Here we are binding data from our component to HTML. Okay. So SD. Okay. Like this we have to bind. So that's it. That is the logic we require. So let's run both our Angular application and API application, and then access the Angular application and check the output. And one more thing I have forgot. We have just created the component, right? Component should be rendered. To render the component, copy the selector from the component, okay, selector name, and go to the app component.html. So here let's add a div and add our selector as a tag name. Okay, now what happens means by default app component will be rendered. Why? App component dot ps file app root. This is added as a tag on index.html file here. Okay, so that is the first component gets rendered. Inside of it, we rendered our child component, that is app student. So that's get rendered here. Okay, so let's run both API and the Angular applications. Okay, this is our Angular application. Let's try to load the Angular application. Okay, here you can see the table, and let's inspect and go to network calls, reload again, page, and see by default our student API call gets invoked, but here you can see error, course error. So what is this course error? Here our Angular application runs on 4200 and our API runs on 7088. So different port numbers. That means different domains. When our client and server are different domains and client try to accessing the API of the server application, then server will return as a course issue because that origin is not allowed to consume the API. So to resolve this issue, we must add course in the API project so that this issue gets fixed. Okay, go to API project, go to program.cs file. First, let's register the service for course. So builder.services.course, add course. Okay, instead of its, let's options dot add policy and specify the name of the type of course we want. Okay, and policy options p dot allow any header. Okay, dot allow any method dot allow any origin. Okay, so this will allow any origin to consume our API. Okay, without any course origin restriction. Now let's add this just above the HTTP redirection. Configure the course origin middleware. And here we need to specify the name of the policy. So I have specified like course, right? Any name you can specify, but the registered name should be used in the course middleware. Okay. Now let's rerun our server application. Now let's reload our API project. Sorry, our Angular project. See, now I got data binded to the bootstrap table. And if you observe the API response, now it is successful. And here in the network calls, we can check on the response, JSON response, and that JSON response is we successfully binded to the bootstrap table. So our next objectives are like implementing HTTP post create action method in API project. Implementing HTTP POST API call at student service in Angular app student component implement the logic to create the new students, implement HTTP put update action method in the API project, implement HTTP put API call in student service Angular project, student component implement logic to update an existing student, and implement HTTP delete action method in the API project, and implement HTTP delete API call at student service in Angular project, and finally student component implement the logic to delete the student. Okay, so in our API project, let's create a HTTP post action method. So this action method going to be invoked by the request of the HTTP post. Okay, so let's create a action method. So post is for creating the new object into our database. Okay, I will name it like post, and post action method should contain the payload. Payload type is nothing but our student model. So what I will do, student dot API dot student, and I will name like payload. Okay, so this payload I am going to receive from the client when the action method is requested. Okay, and it should be decorated with the HTTP post. Since I am going to have only one post action method, so I am not specifying the route explicitly. Okay, so next, using DB context, we have to save our new record. So my DB context dot students dot add payload. So what it will do means, to the DB context state for the student entity, it will update the state like something is added. Add means what? It will update state like state is add, like modify. So DB context is ready to save for something. Okay. So like this, we should add, and next we simply call save changes async on the DB context. So our data that is changed in the context gets saved into the database. And finally, what I am going to do, and it should be awaited. And finally, I just want to return the newly created record. Okay. So payload. So this is my uh, one more action method for creating the record into the database. So let's run the API project and check our endpoint appearing on Swagger or not. And here is our Swagger page, and here you can see a new endpoint has been added to the Swagger page, that is post student. Okay. In our Angular project, go to student service file. So let's create a method that going to invoke our post API. Okay. So I will create a method name like post, and obviously it should contain some payload, right, to send to the server. So this method contains some input data. So that is nothing but a payload. Okay. Of type student. So I simply return this dot HTTP client dot post. So there is a default method for invoking the post call. So use that one post. And since I am going to get the newly created student object, so let's try to define the return type of the response. Okay. And here simply copy paste the same URL. Okay, but now it is a post action method. Okay. And along with the URL, we should some payload, right? So as a second parameter to this method, you can pass the payload. Okay. So that is our post method. Now let's go to our student component and let's implement our logic for creating the uh, new student. Okay. So go to student component.ts file. Okay, so for creating new request, I need to show a pop-up array model. So I am going to use the bootstrap model. So in that bootstrap model, I am going to add form. Okay, so first let's try to open the bootstrap model. So for that, let's go to bootstrap official website, go to docs. Here in the components, go for model. Okay, and scroll down, and let's copy this model HTML. Okay, copy this model HTML and go to our student component.html file. Okay, let's add here. So this is a model HTML, right? And first thing, I want to assign a meaningful name or meaningful ID to my bootstrap model. Okay, so I will name it like add or update model. Okay, so now let's go to our component.ts file. First, let's define a window variable. Okay, because from window we are going to get the bootstrap instance. So to declare a window variable, declare where window API. So now this can read the all window data. Okay, and now let's create a variable here like add or update model. Okay, let's define any. To this model, we must assign the instance of the bootstrap model. Okay, now in the ng on it, let's assign the bootstrap model instance. So this dot add or update. Since we have already defined window variable, right? So new window dot bootstrap dot model. Okay, and inside of it, we need to pass the ID of the HTML model element. Okay, so document dot get element ID, get element by ID, and copy the ID we just added and paste it over here. Okay, this add or update model has control over our bootstrap model, like showing and displaying and hiding, all can be handled with this property. Now I want to open this model pop-up for creating the new record, right? So for that, what we will do, let's add a button like add button in our student HTML page. Okay, so on top of the table, button. Okay, so I want to display the button at the center. I want to leave four sections left and right. So I define offset class, and I want my button in the four column section. Okay, now let me add here a button. Okay, and that button will be add and type should be button. So classes btn, I will add primary color. Okay, so let's define a click method. So for click, we have to write syntax like click. So it's going to raise the click event. So to this click event, we need to define a method in our TS component. So whenever the button hit or click event raises, the logic inside of the method gets executed. Okay. So we need to define a method in TS file. So let's create a method like So first, not for creating, we should open the model pop-up, right? So let me create a method name like open add or update model, because same bootstrap model that contains form we are going to use for both creating a record or updating a record. Okay, so I will name like this, and I am expecting student ID, okay, as a input parameter for this. And next, if student ID equal to 0, then I am going to implement logic regarding the adding the item. Else means not equal to 0 means that record is already exist. Then I am going to implement the logic for update, which we do in upcoming steps. Okay. Now in this model, uh, let me first try to open the bootstrap model. Okay. So this dot add or update model, call the show method. So that's going to display the pop-up. So let's run our application and copy the method. Okay, defined for the click event. And here it is expecting student ID, right? While creating, we don't have student ID. It is new record. So for new record, just pass 0. 0 indicates we are going to implement logic for creating a new student. Okay, now let's run our Angular application and check the output whether we are successfully opening the model pop-up or not. Okay, here is my add button. So let's click on it and see. We are successfully getting the model. Okay, let's make our model pop-up title dynamic. For that, go to student component. So add one more variable like add or update model title. Okay, and let's leave initially empty. So whenever we click on or open add or update model invoke, we just assign the title here. This dot add or update title equal to, I will specify like add. Okay. Okay. Now this title should be rendered on the our HTML, student HTML. So copy this property name, go to our HTML and add the model. You can see here title, right? So using interpolation binding. Okay, let's bind that property. Okay, now we can check the output as well. Click on the add button and now you can see add. Okay, next let's render the form like name, gender, age, so that we can create a records. Okay, for that, here in the form, go to form control. Okay, let's copy this single text area div. Inside of our model body, let's add div 2 times. Okay, and here let's change it like uh, name and ID also name. Next text box I want for uh, name age and change ID also to age, and here input type let's change to text, and here age is number, right? So let me change to number. Okay, now I want one more controller, that is a drop down controller, bootstrap drop down controller. Okay, so let's create. So here select, okay, and let's copy this drop down HTML. Go over here and paste it here. My values are like male. Okay, I want to show drop down for gender options. Okay. Okay. Now I want to enable the model binding. Okay, template driven form binding so that I can, whenever user enters data, that data can be read into my component very easily, two-way binding. So for that, I have to first create the form object here. Okay, so let's create a variable like student form and its type will be student, and let's assign initial values. Okay, age will be 0, gender will be male by default selected. Okay, and name will be empty and ID will be 0. Okay, initial values. So these are my form data initial values. I need to bind this student form data to my uh, form in the HTML. So to bind, we have to use model binding, that is ng model. Okay, ng model. So to use this ng model binding, we need to import the form module in our app component. So go to app component app module.ts. Okay, sorry, app module. So here in the import section, let's import form module. So here form module imported. Form module loads from the Angular/forms. Okay. Now go to our student HTML file, student component HTML file, and now let enable model binding. So what is my form variable and form, right? Student form dot this is for name, and here change name as well. It should be in quotes. Similarly, model bind enable for next text box also, and this is for age, and let's change the label age. Okay, and at the drop down, let's add first label. Okay, gender. So here also we can enable model binding for drop down. Okay, and it should be gender. And we have to maintain our student ID as well in the hidden field. For create, it won't be helpful, but whenever we are doing updating a record at that time, it is mandatory. We should maintain the ID of the record that we want to update. So ID we don't want to change by the user, right? So let's add it as a hidden field. Okay, input and input type equal to hidden, and let's enable model binding for it, and it will be ID. Okay, let's add. And one more thing, let me remove these placeholders. Let's remove this placeholder. Now let's enable a click event for save changes. So click, and I need to add a new method, right? So I will add a new method, create or update. Okay. So this is my new method. Here what I will do, I will check the form data. This dot student form dot id equal to 0. Anyway, we are storing the ID value in hidden field, right? So if it is equal to 0, then it is for logic needs to be executed for the what creating the new record. Else updating the new record, we need to write the logic. Okay. So now what I will do here, I will call the API. So student service dot post. So to this post method, I am going to pass my student form as the input. So on success, let's subscribe the response. Okay. So next, so data will be the single newly created record, right? So what I will do, I want to add display that newly created record on top of my table. So for that, what I will do, this dot students. So this is my collection, right? This contains all our data. So get get call assigns all data to this variable, right? No, what I will do, I will update this collection by using a method unshift, okay, and pass data. So what it unshift will do means it will add the new record at the top of the collection, okay. So that is the use of unshift default JavaScript method, okay. Error simply logs the console error. Okay, this is my creator update method gets executed once save changes button is clicked. Okay, so here let's assign it. And now in the open method, we need to do something like this dot student form equal to I will reassign. So what happens means it will clear every time. If the new record we click on add button, it will clears the data. So this line of code is nothing but resetting the form to original state, means empty state. And now in creator update success method, once the data is assigned, we must close the pop-up, right? This dot add or update model dot hide. So that going to hide the model once the record is saved successfully. The one more small change I did wrong implementation here. I have implemented in else, but it should be in the if. Okay, so please do that change. So else will be for update. We are going to implement later. So now let's run our application and test create a endpoint is working perfectly or not. So click on add button. So now it is open. Let me add a new record. Okay, now click on save changes and make sure to open the developer tool. Okay, and in the developer tool, click on networks and click on fetch and accessor. And now click on save changes button. And pop-up is closed. My new record is successfully added and it is displaying on the top of the table. And if you check the API call, it is 200 successful. And this is my URL and the request method is post method and it is status is 200. If you observe the payload, this is the payload we are sending. And if you observe the preview, this is the response we are getting. So difference is ID is 0 while sending the payload. In the preview, you can see ID is generated. That means record is successfully saved into the database. Okay. So that's all about the create operation in both web API and the Angular application. Okay. Now let's implement update endpoint in the API project first. Okay. So go to API project. Let's implement the update for updating the record. So for that, let's create our action method. Okay, I will name it like update. Okay, so same similar to post, it should also contain the payload and it should be decorated with HTTP put. Okay, and let's name it like put because we are following convention, right? So name the action method also put. But if you have more than one put method, then you can give another name, and in the route we should explicitly specify the route. When we have more than one put method or post method or get method, then we can define the route explicitly. If not, we can ignore the creating the route explicitly. Okay, now using the context students dot update, okay, and pass the payload. So this update method will specify the context that data is need to be updated. Okay, next simply we have to call our save changes async method that get save our data into the database. And I will simply return uh, payload as a response. If you don't specify also not a problem because already on client side you will have this entire object. But as a convention, I'm just resending the same data to the client. Okay. Now let's run our API project and check whether our endpoint is added to the Swagger or not. So here is our Swagger page, and here you can see the put method that is for updating the record. Okay. Now let's go to our Angular application. So we can use all the logic that we have created for the create action method. So here we want to open the model, but when we click on edit button, so first let's add the edit button. For that, to the table let's add one more column. Okay, I will name the column like action, and inside of it let's add a td, and to that let's add our td button. Okay, so type will be button only, and classes button. I want green color, so I will use success btn-success and name the button like edit, and let's register the click method. Click. So same method as add button using same method will be used here. Okay, but now we have to pass the id of the record we want to edit. So sd.id. Now inside of the ts file, what we will do means let's change the title. I want title to be update. Okay, so we are dynamically changing the title, and here this dot student form equal to this dot, okay, student collection. From the student collection let's fetch our required uh, object that need to be edited. Okay, s dot id equal to student id. Okay, filter will return array, right? Let's specify the index first record. So we are assigning the data to the student form, so it will automatically get binded to the form so that we can see the record that need to be edited on the form. Okay, that is the change we required here. And simply remove this line of code for showing the pop-up. We can write it as a common line at the end of the method. Okay, so that will shows the model. And here we have to call the update API, right? We haven't implemented update API. For that, go to student service. Okay, and here let add a method like put that contains payload of student. Okay, return this dot HTTP client dot post, that's going to return student object. Okay, and let's copy these two line of code, paste it here. Okay, almost same, but see, I used post, that is wrong. I need to specify like put. Okay, okay, this is my method. See, get, post, put, that are coming from the HTTP client instance in the Angular library. Now we are ready with our put method. Go to our component. So here, this dot student service dot put. I will send same student form data, almost similar to our post call. Okay. So next, going to receive data, right? So now what I will do, first I will remove the existing old data from the collection. To do that, what I will do, this dot student dot filters, okay, s dot id not equal to data dot id. So I am removing the existing object from the student collection, and again I will update the uh, updated student collection into the collection by specifying unshift method, so that our updated record will appear at the top of the table. Okay, so data. Now there, just copy paste it, and let's close the pop-up once the update is done. Okay, now let's run our application and test update API is working or not. Okay, here you can see edit button, right? So let me click on this edit button, and I will change my name like somebody, and click on update, save changes. Okay, see, my name is successfully updated and the record is appearing at the top of the table. And if I inspect element, if I check the network call, see here, URL and request method is put, and status is 200, and payload is my data, and response is my data. Okay, so that's it. We are successfully implemented the update operation also in both Angular and the .NET API application. Okay, now let's do final step, that is delete operation. So for that, let's implement a action method in our API project. So here let's implement delete action method. So public async task action result delete. Okay, for deleting, if I simply pass ID as a query parameter, that is enough. And our action method should registered with HTTP delete decorator. Okay, and first let's fetch the record that needs to be removed. Okay, student to remove. For that, I will use db context student dot find by async. So find by simply expects the primary key value ID value. Okay, if student to remove equal to null, if user trying to request the invalid record, then simply return uh, return not found. Okay, or else we are going to remove the record. For that, my db context student dot remove and specify the object that need to be removed, and then simply cause the save changes async method, and finally return OK. Okay, this is my delete action method. So let's run the API project and check Swagger has added this endpoint. And here Swagger, you can see the delete endpoint has been added. Now go to our Angular application, and in the student service, let's implement our delete endpoint. Okay. So it's going to get student ID, right? That will be a number. So return this dot http client dot delete. Okay. And here our URL should contain query parameter. That means dynamic value we have to pass to our URL. For that, open backticks, not single quotation. So using backticks, you can do string interpolation, means you can modify the string dynamically. And here ID equal to, okay, dollar and open bracket. So this blue color indicates that is the dynamic value we have to specify. So inside of the bracket, let's pass our student ID. Okay. So that's it, our delete endpoint. Now go to component. So directly calling when the button delete button is clicked, we should show some notification to the user like a delete confirmation. For that, we are going to add one more bootstrap model, right? So if you want to add one more bootstrap model, what we have to do? First, let's create delete model. Okay. To this delete model, we have to assign the instance, right? So to add the instance, first we need to have the HTML, right? Go to Bootstrap website and go back to the model section. Okay. And copy this model again. Go to our HTML. At the bottom, paste the, okay. And here, first let's change the ID of my model. I will name it like delete model. Okay. And here title will be delete. Okay. And body message will be delete confirmation required. Okay. So this is my model pop-up and display. So now go to component. Let's assign instance for this model pop-up. So delete model equal to, copy this line of code and change the ID. So what is my model HTML ID? Delete model. Okay. Now let's create a one more variable. Okay. That is like student to remove student ID to remove. Okay. Will be a number. Initially, I'm going to assign 0. Okay. Now let's create a method like open delete model. Okay. So this model, it contains input parameter like student ID number. Okay. So this number I am going to assign for student ID to remove. Okay. And next, I want to show the pop-up. This dot delete model dot show. Okay. So this method should be assigned to the delete button, right? So in the HTML file, next to the edit button, let's add one more button, that is delete button. Okay. So button delete type equal to button and class will be button I want a red color. For that, I can specify danger. And let's assign click method. So copy the method, open delete model. Okay. Now let's change the delete confirmation model button name to confirm delete, and here also change like danger. And to this confirm delete, we have to create one more method for click event, that is delete. Okay. Now here what we will do, this dot student service dot delete. To the delete, we are going to pass the where ID of the student ID. Okay, student ID to remove, that we are assigned while opening the pop-up, right? And subscribe. I am not dependent on the response from the API. So what I want to do is, first I want to remove the record from the collection so that I can remove it from the table as well. For that, this dot students equal to this dot students dot filter this dot id not equal to this dot student id to be removed. Okay, and this dot student id reset back to 0. Okay, this dot delete model hide it once the operation is successful. Okay, now let's run our application and test the delete endpoint as well. So before testing, let's assign it for the click event of the confirm delete button. So here click delete. Okay, now run both our API and Angular applications and test the delete operation. So here you can see the delete button. If I click on it, see delete confirmation is required. So go to network, let's clear this and confirm delete. See, record is gone. And if you go here, the URL contains ID and request is delete and it is successful. And the record also removed from the table. Okay, so that's all about a CRUD, a complete CRUD using .NET 6 API and Angular 13 application. I hope this video has delivered some useful information to you all. If you like my video, please support me by subscribing to my channel. Soon we are going to meet with new videos. Until then, signing off.